At 60 years old, Margaret Hayes thought she was coming home to disappear. The divorce was final, the house was gone. And after 40 years of marriage, she suddenly found herself completely alone. The only thing she had left was an old family farm sitting at the end of a forgotten country road. Most people thought the property was worthless. The fields were overgrown, the barn was falling apart, and the farmhouse had stood empty for nearly 20 years. But 3 weeks after moving in, Margaret discovered a hidden stone wall beneath the cellar. Behind it was a staircase, and beneath that staircase was a secret basement no one in her family had ever mentioned. Inside were journals, maps, and documents hidden by her grandfather decades earlier. What she found there would uncover the truth about dozens of farms that vanished from the county, and reveal a secret powerful people had spent 40 years trying to keep buried. And before this story is over, Margaret will learn that the farm she returned to after losing everything may have been hiding her family's greatest legacy all along. Margaret Hayes knew her marriage was over 3 months before her husband finally admitted it. The signs arrived quietly. 40 years of marriage had taught her how to read silence better than words. Tom stopped asking about her day. He stopped complaining about television programs she watched. He stopped arguing about small things. At first, the peace felt pleasant. Then it felt wrong. People who love each other still care enough to disagree. People preparing to leave often don't. The conversation happened on a Thursday evening in late October. Margaret remembered the date because she had spent the afternoon planting chrysanthemums near the front porch. The flowers were still on her gloves when Tom sat across from her at the kitchen table and said the sentence that divided her life into before and after. "I think we've grown apart." Margaret stared at him, not because she was shocked, because after 40 years together, that was the best explanation he could offer. Grown apart, as though 4 decades of marriage had drifted away by accident, like a boat slipping from a dock. The rest unfolded exactly as she expected. There was another woman. There were discussions about happiness and second chances. There were speeches that somehow made betrayal sound noble. Margaret listened quietly. She didn't scream, didn't throw dishes, didn't beg him to stay. The truth was simpler. She was tired. By 60 years old, people become selective about where they spend their energy. The divorce finalized 6 months later. Their suburban house sold shortly afterward. Margaret watched strangers walk through rooms where she had raised children, celebrated birthdays, and built an entire life. One afternoon, she stood alone inside the empty living room after the movers left. Every sound echoed. Every wall looked unfamiliar. She expected grief. What she felt instead was exhaustion. 40 years had somehow fit into a handful of cardboard boxes. Her daughter lived in Chicago. Her son lived in Arizona. Both called constantly. Both offered spare bedrooms. Both wanted her nearby. Margaret appreciated the offers. She truly did. But something inside her resisted. She wasn't ready to become someone else's responsibility. Not yet. The solution arrived unexpectedly through an old letter discovered while sorting documents. The property tax notice reminded her of something she had almost forgotten. The farm. Technically, she inherited it nearly 15 years earlier when her grandfather died. At the time, life had been busy. Children, work, marriage. The farm remained little more than paperwork sitting inside a filing cabinet. Now, suddenly, it was the only property she actually owned. 3 weeks later, Margaret loaded everything she had left into a pickup truck and drove 300 miles toward the place where her childhood began. The farm appeared exactly where she remembered it, and nothing like she remembered it. The long gravel driveway remained. The fields remained. The old red barn still stood against the horizon. Yet time had touched everything. Tall grass swallowed fence lines. Weeds covered sections of the pasture. Paint peeled from the farmhouse walls. The property looked abandoned, waiting, forgotten. Margaret parked beside the house and sat quietly for several moments. Wind moved through nearby trees. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called. The sounds felt familiar, comforting. Then she stepped outside. The farmhouse smelled exactly the way old farmhouses should smell. Dust, wood, age, memory. Sunlight streamed through windows onto furniture covered with sheets. Her grandfather's rocking chair still sat beside the fireplace. An old calendar remained hanging in the kitchen. Time had moved forward everywhere except here. Margaret walked slowly from room to room. Every corner carried a memory. Summer visits, Christmas dinners, long afternoons helping her grandfather repair equipment. She hadn't realized how much of herself remained hidden inside this place. By sunset, she was emotionally exhausted. Yet for the first time in months, she didn't feel lost. The feeling surprised her. The farm wasn't beautiful, it wasn't comfortable, it certainly wasn't practical, but it felt real, more real than anything else in her life recently. The following morning began with problems. The roof leaked in 2 places, several pipes needed repairs, half the electrical outlets didn't work, the barn doors barely opened. Margaret spent most of the day making lists. The list grew faster than she could solve anything. Around noon, an old pickup truck appeared at the end of the driveway. A man stepped out wearing overalls and a faded baseball cap. He looked roughly 70, maybe older. The kind of farmer whose age became impossible to estimate because weather had already done most of the counting. "Margaret Hayes," he called. Margaret nodded cautiously. The stranger smiled. "Thought that might be you." He extended a hand. "Walter Green." The name sounded familiar. Then she remembered. Walter owned the neighboring farm decades earlier. "You're Mr. Green's son." The old farmer laughed. "Was. Now I'm just Mr. Green." They spent the next hour sitting on the porch drinking coffee. Walter knew everything happening within 20 miles, which apparently included her divorce, her return, and the condition of every building on the property. "Place needs work," he observed. Margaret looked around. "You're very diplomatic." Walter grinned, trying to be polite. Despite herself, she laughed. It felt good. Walter pointed toward the fields stretching beyond the barn. "Your grandfather loved this land." Margaret smiled softly. "I know." The old farmer became quiet. "Good man." Something about his tone caught her attention. Not sadness exactly, more like respect. Deep respect. The conversation drifted toward old memories, farming, neighbors, people long gone. Then Margaret mentioned finding several boxes of her grandfather's records in the attic. Walter immediately stopped smiling. The reaction lasted less than a second. Yet she noticed. "What?" The old farmer looked away toward the fields. "Nothing." Margaret folded her arms. "That wasn't nothing." Walter sighed heavily. "Your grandfather kept a lot of records." "Most farmers do. Not like Henry." Silence followed. Then Walter stood. "Anyway, if you need help fixing anything, let me know." The subject changed so quickly it practically announced itself. Margaret watched him drive away with a growing sense of curiosity. That evening, she explored the basement beneath the farmhouse while searching for old tools. The space was small, stone walls, dirt floor, shelves lined with forgotten jars and dusty boxes, ordinary cellar stuff. Then she noticed something unusual. One section of the far wall looked different. The stones matched everything around them, yet the mortar appeared newer. Not new, just newer, like someone had repaired part of the wall decades ago. Margaret approached slowly. Her fingertips brushed across rough stone. The section sounded hollow when tapped. She frowned immediately. The rest of the wall felt solid. This portion didn't. She stepped back and examined it more carefully. There, near the corner, a faint marking carved into the stone. Not random scratches, a symbol. Deliberate. Her pulse quickened slightly. The marking looked familiar somehow. Then she remembered she had seen it before, on the cover of one of her grandfather's old notebooks stored upstairs. Margaret stared at the wall for a long moment. Outside, evening settled across the farm. Wind rustled through tall grass. The house creaked softly around her. She had come here expecting repairs, solitude, and maybe a chance to rebuild her life. Instead, standing in the dim cellar beneath her family farmhouse, she suddenly had the strange feeling that her grandfather had left something behind. Something he wanted found. And whatever it was, appeared to be hidden behind that wall. Margaret spent the entire next morning thinking about the wall. Not the leaking roof. Not the broken fence near the western pasture. Not the dozens of repairs competing for her attention. The wall. Every task somehow led her thoughts back to the cellar. The carved symbol, the hollow sound, the strange reaction from Walter Green when her grandfather's records came up. Individually, none of it meant much. Together, it felt like the beginning of something. By noon, she finally gave up pretending she could focus on anything else. Armed with a flashlight, a hammer, and more curiosity than common sense, she returned to the cellar. Sunlight filtered weakly through a small basement window near the ceiling. Dust floated through the air. The stone wall waited exactly where she left it. Silent, unremarkable. Yet now she noticed details she had missed before. The mortar surrounding that particular section looked newer than the rest. Not recent, perhaps 30 or 40 years newer. Someone had deliberately altered the wall long after the farmhouse was built. Margaret ran her fingers across the carved symbol again. A simple design, a circle intersected by two straight lines. Familiar. She knew she had seen it somewhere. The problem was remembering where. After another 20 minutes of examination, she accepted an uncomfortable truth. If there was a secret behind the wall, she wasn't going to uncover it by staring. Unfortunately, dismantling part of a century-old farmhouse without understanding the consequences seemed like a poor idea. Reluctantly, she decided to wait. Patience had solved more problems than impulse over the course of 60 years. Around 3 o'clock, Walter Green returned carrying a toolbox large enough to repair a battleship. "Figured I'd save your roof before the next rainstorm." Margaret smiled. "You're beginning to make the rest of the county look lazy." Walter laughed. "Most of them are." The old farmer spent the afternoon repairing loose shingles, while Margaret worked nearby clearing weeds from around the porch. The arrangement felt oddly comfortable. Simple conversation, shared work, no expectations, no complications. She realized how much she missed that. Near sunset, they sat on overturned buckets, drinking lemonade. The fields stretched golden beneath the fading light. Crickets had already begun their evening chorus. It felt peaceful. Then Margaret decided to ask, "Why did you get nervous yesterday?" Walter glanced sideways. "About what?" "My grandfather's records." The old farmer immediately focused on his lemonade. Not exactly subtle. Margaret waited. Eventually, Walter sighed. Henry was different. Different how? Most farmers worry about crops. Another pause. Henry worried about people. The answer raised more questions than it solved. Walter seemed aware of that. There was a difficult time around here. Margaret nodded. Every farming community had difficult times. Droughts, recessions, market crashes. What kind of difficult? The old farmer stared toward the horizon. The 80s. His voice grew quieter. A lot of farms disappeared. Margaret frowned. Disappeared? Walter nodded. Families lost land, lost homes, lost everything. She studied him carefully. The emotion was real, deeply real. What did Grandpa have to do with that? Walter hesitated long enough to answer the question without speaking. More than most people knew. Then he stood. Conversation over. Subject closed. Margaret watched him walk toward his trunk, frustration mixed with curiosity. Everybody seemed to know pieces of a story nobody wanted to tell completely. That evening, she climbed into the attic searching for the notebook bearing the carved symbol. The attic occupied most of the farmhouse upper level. Boxes filled nearly every corner. Family photographs, old clothing, farming records, forgotten decades stacked neatly beneath layers of dust. It took nearly an hour before she found the notebook. The cover immediately confirmed her memory. There was the symbol, identical to the one carved into the cellar wall. Her pulse quickened. She opened the notebook carefully. Most pages contained ordinary farm records, equipment purchases, crop yields, maintenance notes. Then she discovered something odd. Several pages referenced locations using the symbol as a marker. No explanations, just sketches, measurements, directions. Almost like a code. Margaret sat cross-legged on the attic floor studying the entries. One page finally stood out. Beneath the symbol, her grandfather had written a single sentence. "Some things are safer underground." The words sent a chill through her, not because they sounded threatening, because they sounded intentional, deliberate, like instructions. She carried the notebook downstairs immediately. The cellar wall suddenly looked very different. What if her grandfather wasn't hiding something from strangers? What if he was preserving something for family? The possibility changed everything. Over the next 2 days, Margaret continued restoring portions of the farmhouse while quietly researching local history. Most information seemed ordinary. Agricultural reports, census data, property records. Then she noticed a pattern. Walter wasn't exaggerating. Farms really had vanished. Entire family names appearing in older records disappeared from modern maps. Carter, Donnelly, Simmons, Burke. Families who once owned hundreds of acres no longer appeared anywhere. Some land had been consolidated, some sold, some transferred through foreclosure. The numbers felt alarming. By Friday afternoon, curiosity pushed her into town. The county courthouse occupied a brick building near the town square. Inside, dusty records stretched back more than a century. Margaret spent several hours examining historical property maps. The deeper she looked, the stranger things became. Huge sections of farmland changed ownership during a relatively short period, too quickly, too consistently. It wasn't proof of anything, yet something felt wrong. As she gathered her notes, a woman's voice interrupted nearby. "Most people don't look at those maps." Margaret turned. The speaker appeared to be in her mid-30s, smartly dressed, sharp eyes, confident posture. She carried several archive boxes. "Excuse me," the woman smiled. "Those property transfers?" She nodded toward the documents. "I've been studying them for years." Margaret blinked. "You have?" "Emma Carter." She extended a hand. "County Historical Society." Margaret introduced herself. The reaction was immediate. "Hayes." Emma tilted her head slightly. "Henry Hayes's granddaughter." Margaret nodded. Emma's expression changed, not surprise, recognition. "Interesting." Margaret folded her arms. "That's becoming a very common response lately." Emma laughed softly. "Your grandfather was famous around here." "For what?" The historian became thoughtful. "Depends who you ask." That answer felt strangely familiar. Another person with half a story. Another mystery. Before leaving, Emma handed over a business card. "If you're sorting through Henry's records, call me." Margaret studied the card. "Why?" Emma smiled faintly. "Because some of the missing pieces might still be on your farm." The statement followed Margaret all the way home. By dusk, she was standing once again in the cellar, flashlight in one hand, notebook in the other. The hollow wall waited patiently in the shadows. The symbol carved into the stone seemed almost deliberate now, like a signpost, like an invitation. Margaret tapped the wall once more. Hollow. Definitely hollow. Then she noticed something she had somehow missed before. Near the floor, partially hidden behind decades of dust, a narrow iron ring protruded from the stonework. Her heartbeat immediately accelerated. Slowly, she knelt and brushed away dirt. The ring wasn't part of the original construction. It was attached to a perfectly rectangular section of stone. A concealed panel. Margaret stared for several seconds, then carefully wrapped her fingers around the ring. Whatever waited behind that wall, she realized, was no accident. Her grandfather wanted it hidden, and judging by the craftsmanship, he wanted it found only by someone willing to look closely enough. Margaret waited until the next morning before pulling the iron ring. Part of the decision came from caution. The other part came from 60 years of experience teaching her that major discoveries rarely improved after midnight. She slept poorly nonetheless. Every time she closed her eyes, she pictured the hidden panel in the cellar, her grandfather's notebook, the symbol, Walter's uncomfortable silence, Emma Carter's warning about missing pieces. By sunrise, curiosity had completely defeated patience. Coffee in hand, flashlight tucked beneath one arm, Margaret descended into the cellar. The farmhouse remained quiet around her. Wind brushed gently against the windows upstairs. Somewhere outside, birds moved through the old orchard. Ordinary sounds, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. The concealed panel waited exactly where she left it. She brushed away a final layer of dirt and wrapped both hands around the iron ring. The metal felt cold, heavy. For several seconds, she simply stared. Then she pulled. Nothing happened. Margaret frowned and pulled harder. A grinding sound echoed through the cellar. Stone scraped against stone. Dust drifted into the air. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the rectangular section shifted outward. Her pulse quickened immediately. Behind the panel sat darkness. Not a storage compartment, not a cavity inside the wall, a passage. Margaret aimed her flashlight inside. Stone steps descended beyond the farmhouse foundation. She froze. The staircase looked ancient, much older than the hidden wall concealing it. "Well," she whispered, "that's new." For a moment, common sense suggested calling someone. Walter, Emma, maybe both. Then another thought arrived. Her grandfather had hidden this place for decades. If she called people now, she would spend the next several hours answering questions instead of finding answers. Curiosity won. Again, she stepped through the opening and began descending. The staircase extended farther than expected. The air grew cooler with every step. The stone walls felt damp beneath her fingertips. Eventually, the stairs ended at a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron straps. Margaret stopped. The door looked original, not modern, not recently installed, old enough to belong there. Yet one detail stood out immediately. A lock. Her grandfather hadn't merely hidden the staircase. He locked whatever waited beyond it. Margaret examined the mechanism carefully, then laughed softly. The keyhole matched a small brass key she discovered weeks earlier inside a box of Henry Hayes' personal belongings. At the time, she assumed it opened an old cabinet or equipment shed. Apparently not. Sometimes her grandfather's sense of humor crossed generations. She hurried back upstairs. 20 minutes later, key in hand, she returned to the door. The lock opened on the first turn. A loud click echoed through the passage. Her heartbeat accelerated. Slowly, she pushed the door inward. Dust drifted through the beam of her flashlight. Then the room emerged from darkness. Margaret stood frozen. The hidden basement stretched nearly the entire length of the farmhouse. Shelves lined every wall. Filing cabinets occupied one corner. Wooden crates filled another. A large work table sat at the center of the room. Everything appeared organized, preserved, intentional. This wasn't a forgotten storage space. It was an archive. For several moments, she simply stared. The scope overwhelmed her. Her grandfather hadn't hidden a few keepsakes. He had hidden an entire collection. The room felt less like a basement and more like a private museum. Margaret moved carefully between shelves. Boxes carried handwritten labels, farm records, community meetings, land surveys, correspondence. Her pulse quickened. None of this looked ordinary. Then she spotted a photograph resting atop the work table. The image showed Henry Hayes standing beside several other farmers, men and women of different ages. Everyone looked serious, determined. On the back, her grandfather had written a date, August 1985. Last meeting before everything changed. Margaret stared at the sentence. The same phrase appeared before everything changed. People kept referencing an event nobody wanted to explain directly. She set the photograph down and opened the nearest filing cabinet. Hundreds of documents filled the drawers. Property maps, financial records, loan agreements, newspaper clippings. The sheer volume seemed impossible. Henry Hayes spent years collecting this material, perhaps decades. Why? The answer arrived sooner than expected. Near the back of one drawer, she discovered a leather journal. The cover carried her grandfather's initials, H.H. Margaret immediately sat down. She opened the first page carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable, strong, precise, familiar. At first, the entries seemed ordinary, notes about crops, weather, equipment repairs. Then the tone shifted. Entire sections focused on neighboring farms, financial struggles, loan disputes, meetings with bankers, government officials. The deeper she read, the more concerned she became. Families were losing land. Entire farms were disappearing, not because crops failed, not because people stopped working. Something else was happening. Then she reached an entry that made her sit up straight. They aren't buying land. They're manufacturing failure. Margaret read the sentence twice, then a third time. Manufacturing failure. The phrase felt wrong, disturbing. She continued reading. Henry described farmers receiving sudden loan adjustments, unexpected appraisals, foreclosure notices, land values changing overnight. Individually, each event seemed explainable. Together, they formed a pattern, a dangerous one. Hours disappeared. Sunlight shifted overhead while Margaret remained buried in journals and documents. The hidden basement revealed more questions than answers. Then she discovered a map pinned to the far wall. Every farm in the county appeared marked. Red circles surrounded dozens of properties. Many names looked familiar from historical records she reviewed with Emma. Farms that no longer existed. Her stomach tightened. Whatever happened here affected far more people than she imagined. Around mid-afternoon, footsteps sounded above. Margaret nearly jumped. For a brief moment, she forgot she wasn't alone in the world. She climbed the staircase and found Walter Green standing inside the cellar. The old farmer looked relieved. "I knocked for 10 minutes. Margaret smiled sheepishly. "Sorry." Then she noticed his expression. "What's wrong?" Walter pointed toward the open wall. Silence followed. Long silence. The old farmer stared at the hidden passage as though he had seen a ghost. "You found it." Not a question, a statement. Margaret nodded slowly. Walter removed his cap. His hands trembled slightly. For several seconds, he couldn't seem to look away from the opening. Finally, he sighed. "I always wondered if Henry actually built it." Margaret frowned. "You knew?" "Not exactly." Walter stepped closer. "I knew he was hiding something." The old farmer looked older suddenly, tired, burdened. A lot of people thought he was obsessed. Margaret folded her arms. "Obsessed with what?" Walter met her eyes. "Finding out why so many good farmers lost everything." Silence settled across the cellar. Then Margaret made a decision. She led Walter down into the hidden basement. The moment he entered, the old farmer stopped walking. His eyes moved slowly across the shelves, the filing cabinets, the maps, the journals. Emotion crossed his face. Real emotion. Dear God. Margaret watched him carefully. "What is it?" Walter looked toward the wall of marked farms. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Henry kept everything." The statement lingered, because it sounded less like surprise and more like recognition. Like Walter finally understood something. Then he pointed toward a section of filing cabinets near the back. If he was collecting evidence... Margaret felt her pulse quicken. Evidence of what? The old farmer stared at the cabinets. "That's where he'll have hidden the important stuff." Suddenly, the room felt even larger, more mysterious. Because if everything she found so far wasn't the important part, then whatever remained hidden inside those cabinets might explain why her grandfather spent decades building a secret basement beneath the family farm. Walter Green stayed in the hidden basement until nearly sunset. For most of that time, he barely spoke. He moved slowly between shelves, running weathered fingers across boxes and filing cabinets as though walking through a graveyard. Margaret noticed the way his expression changed whenever he recognized a name. Sometimes sadness, sometimes disbelief, occasionally anger. Real anger, the kind that survives decades. She watched him stop beside a wall map covered with red circles. "I knew almost every family on here," he said quietly. Margaret looked at the names. Dozens of them, maybe more. What happened to them? Walter laughed once. There was no humor in it. Depends who tells the story. The answer was becoming familiar. Everyone seemed to possess part of the truth. Nobody seemed eager to tell all of it. The old farmer eventually settled at the large work table and opened one of Henry Hayes's journals. Several minutes passed before he spoke again. "People thought your grandfather was stubborn." Margaret smiled. "He was." Walter nodded. "That's true." Then he tapped the journal. "But he was also right more often than people liked." The statement lingered, because it sounded important. Before leaving, Walter offered one final piece of advice. "Call Emma." Margaret frowned. "Why?" The old farmer glanced around the basement. "Because whatever Henry was collecting, it's bigger than one farm." He paused. "And bigger than one person." The next morning, Margaret did exactly that. Emma Carter arrived shortly after lunch carrying 2 notebooks, a camera, and enough excitement to make coffee unnecessary. The historian's reaction to the hidden basement was immediate. "You're kidding." Margaret smiled. "That seems to be the standard response." Emma ignored her completely. She was already moving through the room, examining shelves and boxes. "This is incredible." The historian sounded genuinely awed. "Do you realize what this is?" Margaret looked around. "A lot of paperwork." Emma laughed. "This is an archive." She turned slowly in place. "Your grandfather built his own archive." For the next several hours, they worked together cataloging materials. The deeper Emma looked, the more excited she became. Property maps, financial statements, agricultural reports, correspondence, meeting minutes, thousands of documents. Henry Hayes hadn't been collecting random information. He had been documenting something specific, something systematic. Then Emma discovered a series of folders hidden inside one filing cabinet drawer. The labels immediately stood out. Foreclosures, appraisals, acquisitions. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. Emma opened the first folder carefully. Silence followed. Then another folder, more silence. Finally, the historian sat down heavily. "Oh." Margaret immediately noticed the change. "What?" Emma handed over several documents. "Look at the dates." Margaret did. Most paperwork involved farms lost during the agricultural crisis of the 1980s, loan defaults, property seizures, forced sales. At first, everything appeared normal. Then patterns emerged. The same appraisal companies appeared repeatedly. The same financial institutions. The same legal representatives. Over and over again. "That's strange." Emma nodded. "Very." They continued reviewing files. The pattern only became stronger. Certain farms received dramatically reduced property valuations shortly before foreclosure. Others suddenly lost financing, despite years of successful operation. Some owners received notices containing obvious errors. Individually, none of it proved wrongdoing. Together, it felt increasingly suspicious. Then Margaret found something unusual. Hidden among financial records sat a collection of handwritten interview notes. Her grandfather had spoken directly with affected farmers. The pages documented conversations, concerns, complaints, warnings. One quote caught her attention immediately. "They lowered my land value by half in 6 months." Another followed. "The bank approved my loan renewal, then canceled it 2 weeks later." Then another. Somebody already knew who was going to lose their farms. Margaret slowly lowered the pages. Emma looked equally disturbed. "Your grandfather wasn't collecting history." "No," Margaret agreed. "He was investigating." The realization changed everything. Henry Hayes hadn't built a hidden archive to preserve memories. He built it to preserve evidence. The distinction felt important. Suddenly, a loud sound echoed from upstairs. Both women froze. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps crossing the farmhouse floor. Margaret's stomach tightened instantly. She wasn't expecting visitors. Neither woman spoke. Another footstep sounded overhead. Then another. Emma quietly closed the folder in front of her. Margaret reached for a flashlight without fully understanding why. The silence that followed felt worse than the noise. Finally, they climbed the staircase together. The farmhouse appeared empty. Front door closed. Windows secured. No obvious signs of intrusion. Yet someone had definitely been inside. Margaret knew what she heard. Then Emma noticed it first. "The office." They hurried across the house. Margaret's small office sat near the front porch. The door stood slightly open. Her stomach dropped immediately. Inside, desk drawers had been pulled out. Papers covered the floor. Filing boxes sat overturned. Nothing valuable appeared missing. No electronics, no cash, no personal items. Only documents had been disturbed. Emma stared silently. Margaret felt anger replace surprise. Someone was searching. The historian nodded. For records. They spent the next 20 minutes checking the house. Whoever entered was gone. The break-in seemed targeted, specific, deliberate. Then Margaret noticed something missing. One folder from Henry's archive had disappeared. Not the largest, not the most obvious. A small folder labeled Land Valuations. Her pulse quickened immediately. The intruder knew exactly what to take, which meant something even more disturbing. They knew what existed. The realization settled heavily over both women. This wasn't random vandalism. Someone knew about Henry's records. Someone knew about the investigation he spent years conducting. More importantly, someone was still worried about those records decades later. As evening approached, Emma helped organize the scattered papers. The farmhouse felt different now. Less isolated, more exposed, like an invisible line had been crossed. Then Margaret discovered something unexpected. A single piece of paper rested atop her desk. It hadn't been there earlier. She was certain of it. Typed words covered the page. Nothing more, nothing less. Some things should stay buried. Margaret stared at the message, then slowly looked toward the hidden basement concealed beneath her farmhouse. For the first time since discovering the archive, she realized something important. Her grandfather hadn't hidden those records because he was afraid people wouldn't find them. He hid them because he was afraid the wrong people would. Margaret expected fear after the break-in. Instead, she woke up angry. The typed note sat on her kitchen table beside a half-finished cup of coffee. Some things should stay buried. She had read the message at least 20 times since discovering it. Every time, the same thought returned. Whoever left it believed they still controlled the story. That bothered her more than the intrusion itself. For 40 years, someone had apparently decided which farms mattered, which families were remembered, and which truths disappeared. Margaret had spent most of her life avoiding conflict. At 60 years old, she found herself surprisingly unwilling to start now. The morning sunlight stretched across the farmhouse kitchen. Outside, the fields swayed gently beneath a cool breeze. Everything looked peaceful. Yet beneath the house sat a hidden archive large enough to make strangers break into private property. Peace, she was learning, could be deceptive. Shortly after 9, Emma arrived carrying breakfast sandwiches and a stack of county records. "How are you doing?" Margaret glanced toward the note. "I was threatened by someone who uses office stationery." Emma laughed despite herself. "Good. You're still angry. Is that good? Much better than scared." The historian spread documents across the kitchen table. For the next several hours, they compared Henry's records against official county archives. The results were troubling. Farms identified in Henry's files repeatedly showed the same patterns: sudden valuation changes, loan complications, rapid ownership transfers. Many properties ended up controlled by the same corporate entities. Different names appeared on paperwork, but Emma quickly discovered connections: parent companies, subsidiaries, shared legal representation. The deeper they looked, the less random everything seemed. Then Margaret found something unexpected. One name appeared repeatedly throughout Henry's journals: Grayson Agricultural Holdings. The company existed in nearly every major land transfer, every foreclosure cluster, every questionable acquisition. "Do they still exist?" Margaret asked. Emma immediately nodded. "Very much." She opened her laptop and searched. A company website appeared. Modern headquarters, corporate branding, thousands of acres under management. The current CEO stared confidently from the homepage. Victor Grayson. Margaret studied the photograph. Expensive suit, perfect smile. The sort of face that appeared trustworthy until you looked a little longer. "You know him?" Emma asked. Margaret shook her head. "Not yet." The phrase sounded strange even to her. Around noon, Walter Green arrived unexpectedly. The old farmer looked concerned the moment he stepped inside. "Heard about the break-in?" News traveled quickly in rural communities. Margaret nodded. "Someone left us a note." Walter's expression darkened immediately. "Figures." The response caught everyone's attention. Emma leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Walter sat down heavily. For several seconds, he stared out the window toward the fields. Then he sighed. "Because it happened before." Silence settled across the room. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "Before?" The old farmer nodded slowly. "Back when Henry was collecting information." Neither woman spoke. Walter rarely volunteered information. Interrupting him would have been a mistake. People thought he was paranoid. His voice grew quieter. Tools went missing. Records disappeared. Strange vehicles parked near the farm. Margaret exchanged a glance with Emma. The similarities were impossible to ignore. "Did Grandpa ever say who was responsible?" Walter laughed softly. Henry didn't speculate. He paused. He preferred proof. The answer felt exactly right. Everything Margaret had discovered so far suggested the same thing. Henry Hayes wasn't interested in rumors. He documented facts. Then Walter surprised them. There was one meeting. Margaret immediately leaned forward. "What meeting?" The old farmer rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Near the end, what happened? Walter stared toward the hidden cellar door. Henry said he'd finally figured it out. The room became very quiet. Emma set down her pen. Margaret barely breathed. Figured what out? Walter looked genuinely frustrated. He never told me. The answer landed heavily. Henry spent years gathering evidence, years investigating disappearing farms, then apparently reached a conclusion he shared with almost nobody. The mystery deepened once again. Later that afternoon, Emma continued cataloging materials in the hidden basement while Margaret explored sections they hadn't fully examined. The room seemed larger every day. More shelves, more boxes, more secrets. Eventually, she reached a row of cabinets near the rear wall. Unlike the others, these drawers carried no labels, just numbers, 1 through 12. Curious, she opened the first drawer. Property records. The second contained correspondence. The third held appraisal reports. Then she reached drawer 7. The moment it opened, she knew it mattered. Every folder inside carried individual farm names: Carter Farm, Donnelly Farm, Burke Farm, Simmons Farm. Families, not corporations. Families. Margaret selected one folder at random and sat down. The contents told a devastating story. Loan documents, tax records, appraisals, personal letters, newspaper clippings. Henry had assembled complete histories for each farm. Not just financial information, human information. The final page stopped her cold. A handwritten note from Henry. They never missed a payment until the appraisal changed. Margaret stared at the sentence, then opened another folder. Similar note. Another. Similar note again. A pattern emerged. The farmers weren't failing first. The circumstances around them changed first. Land values, financing, loan conditions. Then came foreclosure, then acquisition. Margaret felt anger rising again, not because she fully understood the scheme yet, because she understood enough. Real people suffered. Real families lost homes. Somebody benefited. Then she found the photograph. It had slipped between 2 folders. The image showed a group of men standing outside a county building sometime in the 1980s. Most faces meant nothing. One did. Margaret recognized him immediately from the company website. A younger version of Victor Grayson, or rather, his father. The resemblance was unmistakable. On the back of the photograph, Henry had written a single sentence. The meeting that started everything. Margaret stared at the words. Her pulse accelerated. The photograph felt important, critical even. Then she noticed something else. A name circled near the edge of the image. Harold Pierce. She had seen the name before. Somewhere. Minutes later, she found it. Henry mentioned Pierce repeatedly throughout several journals. Banker, land consultant, key participant in numerous transactions. One of the central figures in whatever happened. Excitement mixed with frustration. Every answer produced 3 more questions. Then a sound echoed from upstairs. A vehicle. Margaret immediately recognized tires crunching across gravel. She climbed the staircase quickly. Through the front window, she saw a black SUV approaching the farmhouse. Expensive. New. Completely out of place on a rural dirt road. The vehicle stopped near the porch. A man stepped out, tall, well-dressed, confident. Margaret didn't recognize him personally, yet somehow she already knew who he was. The man removed his sunglasses and looked directly toward the farmhouse. Then he smiled, not warmly, not kindly, deliberately. A smile from someone who believed he belonged there. Margaret's stomach tightened. The visitor climbed the porch steps and knocked once. Calm, professional, patient. Behind her, Emma emerged from the cellar. Walter stood from the kitchen table. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Because after weeks of chasing shadows through old records, the story had finally stepped onto the front porch and knocked on the door. Victor Grayson looked exactly like the kind of man who never heard the word no. Margaret noticed it the moment she opened the farmhouse door. Everything about him projected confidence. The tailored jacket, the polished boots that somehow remained spotless despite the gravel driveway, the relaxed smile that never quite reached his eyes. He appeared to be in his early 60s, successful, controlled. Dangerous in the way wealthy people often became when they were accustomed to getting what they wanted. Mrs. Hayes. His voice was warm, practiced. Thank you for seeing me. Margaret folded her arms. I don't remember agreeing to that. For a brief moment, something flickered behind the smile. Then it disappeared. Fair enough. Victor glanced past her into the farmhouse. His eyes lingered slightly too long, searching, evaluating. May I come in? Margaret considered refusing, then decided she wanted answers more than comfort. For a few minutes. Victor stepped inside. Emma appeared from the hallway. Walter remained seated at the kitchen table. The old farmer's expression darkened immediately. Victor noticed him and paused. Walter Green? Walter didn't stand. Victor. The absence of friendliness filled the room. Margaret noticed. So did Emma. Victor sat calmly at the kitchen table while Margaret remained standing. She wanted him to understand something from the beginning. This wasn't a social visit. What do you want? Victor smiled politely. Direct. I appreciate that. Margaret waited. The businessman glanced around the kitchen. Beautiful property. Still waiting. Another brief smile. I've heard you're planning to stay. There it was. Not a question. A test. Margaret answered carefully. Why does that matter? Victor folded his hands together. Because Grayson Agricultural Holdings owns substantial acreage surrounding this farm. Emma quietly rolled her eyes. Walter looked ready to throw something. Victor ignored both reactions. We've been interested in this property for years. Margaret laughed softly. Funny timing. The smile tightened again. Barely, yet enough. Business opportunities often require patience. The answer sounded harmless. It wasn't. Margaret could feel it. Let me guess, she said. You want to buy the farm? Victor leaned back slightly. Actually, I'd like to make an offer. Of course he would. The conversation continued exactly as Margaret expected. Victor described development opportunities, regional investment, agricultural efficiency, corporate stewardship. Every sentence sounded polished. Every explanation sounded reasonable. Yet something felt wrong. He wasn't talking about land, he was talking around it. Then he finally named a number. Margaret blinked. Emma blinked. Even Walter looked surprised. The offer was enormous. More money than the property realistically justified. More money than any neglected farm should be worth. Victor watched her reaction carefully, like a fisherman feeling tension on a line. Generous, Margaret admitted. Very. Victor nodded. You deserve a fresh start. The phrase irritated her immediately. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because it sounded rehearsed. Maybe because he knew enough about her life to use it. Margaret stared directly at him. No. Silence followed. Victor didn't look surprised, which told her something important. He expected resistance. Perhaps you should think about it. I already did. The businessman remained calm. People often make emotional decisions when they first return home. Walter laughed suddenly, a harsh, humorless sound. Victor glanced toward him. The old farmer didn't bother hiding his contempt. That's rich. The room grew colder. Victor's expression hardened slightly, just enough. Margaret noticed the change immediately. The polite mask wasn't gone, but it had shifted. Walter, Victor said evenly, we've known each other a long time. Not by choice. Emma covered a smile with her coffee mug. Victor ignored the remark. Then his attention returned to Margaret. Your grandfather was a respected man. That got her attention. You knew him? Victor paused. Our families crossed paths occasionally. Another carefully chosen answer. Another non-answer. Margaret was beginning to dislike those. Did those paths cross during the farm crisis? Silence. The room became very quiet. Even Walter stopped moving. Victor's eyes settled on hers. For the first time, the friendliness disappeared completely. Not anger. Calculation. I wasn't aware you were interested in local history. Margaret smiled faintly. I'm becoming interested. Several long seconds passed. Then Victor stood. History can be complicated. So I've heard. He adjusted his jacket. Some stories sound very different depending on who tells them. The statement landed heavily because it wasn't advice. It was a warning disguised as wisdom. Victor headed toward the door, then stopped. One more thing. Margaret waited. The businessman looked around the farmhouse one final time. Be careful about assumptions. His gaze lingered for half a second too long on the cellar door. Then he smiled. Good day, Mrs. Hayes. The SUV disappeared down the gravel road minutes later. Nobody spoke until it vanished completely. Then Emma exhaled loudly. Well, Walter shook his head. Same family. Margaret looked at him. What does that mean? The old farmer stared through the window toward the fields. His father was exactly the same. The answer sent a chill through her, because she had seen Victor's father already, not in person, in Henry's files, in old photographs, in documents connected to disappearing farms. Suddenly, the visit felt much more important than a simple business offer. Victor didn't come because he wanted land. He came because he wanted information. Or perhaps to learn how much information she already had. That realization followed Margaret downstairs into the hidden basement later that afternoon. The archive felt different now. More dangerous somehow. Every document represented something someone once wanted hidden. Then she remembered the photograph from yesterday, the one labeled, "The Meeting That Started Everything." She retrieved it and studied it more carefully. This time she focused on faces instead of names. There, standing beside Victor's father, was Harold Pierce, the banker Henry mentioned repeatedly. Nearby stood several county officials, land consultants, lawyers, people with influence, people with power. Then Margaret noticed something she had missed before, a building in the background. The photograph had been taken outside an old grain elevator. Her pulse quickened. She had seen that structure before, not in person, on one of Henry's maps. Excited, she searched through nearby folders. Several minutes later, she found it. A county survey map marked with handwritten notes. One location carried a circle around it. The abandoned grain elevator north of town. Beside the circle, Henry had written 3 words. If needed. Here. Margaret stared at the note, then reread it. If needed. Here. Not storage records, not agricultural data. Instructions. Hidden instructions. The kind a person leaves when planning ahead. Her heartbeat accelerated. She opened another journal, then another. Finally, she found a reference. Brief, easy to overlook, yet unmistakable. Moved copies to the elevator. Safer there. Margaret slowly lowered the journal. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Henry hadn't kept all his evidence beneath the farmhouse. Some of it had been moved somewhere else, somewhere he considered safer, somewhere nobody would think to search. The abandoned grain elevator. Above her, the farmhouse creaked softly in the evening wind. Outside, the fields stretched toward the horizon exactly as they had for generations. Yet Margaret knew something had changed. Victor Grayson hadn't driven all the way out here for a farm. He came because he was worried. And if Henry Hayes had hidden additional evidence somewhere beyond the property, then whatever remained at that grain elevator might finally explain why. Margaret spent most of the night thinking about the grain elevator. Sleep came in short fragments. Every time she drifted off, her mind returned to the same sentence written in Henry Hayes's journal. Moved copies to the elevator. Safer there. The words seemed simple, yet they changed everything. Until now. The hidden basement felt like the center of the mystery. Suddenly it looked more like one piece of a much larger puzzle. If Henry had hidden evidence somewhere else, then he never fully trusted the basement. More importantly, he expected someone might eventually find it. By sunrise. Margaret had already made up her mind. She was going to the grain elevator. The question wasn't whether. It was when. Emma arrived shortly after breakfast, carrying additional property records from the county archives. Walter appeared 10 minutes later with a toolbox and no explanation whatsoever. Margaret suspected he simply enjoyed appearing when things became interesting. They gathered around the kitchen table while she explained the journal entry. The reaction was immediate. Emma nearly spilled her coffee. The old grain elevator. Margaret nodded. Walter rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Hasn't been used in decades. Which makes it a good hiding place, Emma pointed out. The old farmer reluctantly agreed. Unfortunately, there was a problem. The elevator sat on private property, technically abandoned, legally complicated, exactly the sort of place likely to attract trouble. Margaret looked around the table. We're going anyway. Neither Emma nor Walter seemed surprised. Around noon, they loaded supplies into Walter's truck and headed north. The grain elevator appeared exactly as Margaret imagined. Massive, weathered, forgotten. The concrete structure towered above surrounding farmland like a monument from another era. Rust covered exposed metal. Broken windows stared across empty fields. Tall weeds surrounded the property. Nature had been slowly reclaiming the place for years. Yet despite the decay, the building remained imposing. Cheerful place, Emma muttered. Walter laughed softly. You should have seen it 40 years ago. The old farmer parked beside a collapsing loading dock. For several moments, nobody moved. The elevator seemed to absorb sound. Even the wind felt quieter here. Finally, Margaret opened her door. Let's see what Grandpa was hiding. The interior smelled of dust, rust, and old grain. Sunlight filtered through broken windows, creating long beams across the darkness. Massive machinery loomed overhead: conveyors, hoppers, storage bins, equipment that once supported hundreds of local farms. Now everything sat silent, forgotten. The symbolism wasn't lost on Margaret. They spent nearly an hour searching. Storage rooms, offices, maintenance areas. Most contained nothing except debris and memories. Emma was beginning to lose patience when Walter stopped suddenly near the rear of the building. "Wait." Margaret looked up. "What?" The old farmer pointed toward a wall hidden behind several rusted shelves. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then the shape emerged. A symbol carved into the concrete. The same symbol found on the cellar wall. The same symbol from Henry's notebook. Her pulse quickened instantly. No way. Emma was already moving toward it. The historian examined the marking carefully. That's definitely Henry's. The discovery energized everyone. Suddenly, the grain elevator wasn't merely a possibility, it was a destination, a clue, a message left intentionally. They began searching the surrounding area more carefully. 20 minutes later, Margaret found a loose metal panel concealed behind old equipment. The compartment hidden behind it wasn't large, just enough space for a lockbox, which was exactly what she found. Her heartbeat accelerated. The box appeared old but intact. Dust covered every surface. Nobody had touched it in years, perhaps decades. "Tell me you have a key." Emma looked hopeful. Margaret smiled slowly. "Actually," she reached into her pocket. Several weeks earlier, she discovered a second brass key among Henry's belongings. Unlike the first, she never found a matching lock. Until now. The key slid into place perfectly. A loud click echoed through the elevator. Silence followed. Then Margaret lifted the lid. Inside rested several folders, a ledger, and a thick stack of cassette tapes. For several moments, nobody spoke. The contents looked ordinary, yet all three understood they weren't. Henry Hayes had hidden these materials separately from the basement archive. That alone made them important. Margaret opened the ledger first. The pages inside immediately caught her attention. Names, dates, dollar amounts, loan numbers, property transfers, hundreds of entries carefully recorded over many years. Emma leaned closer. Then her eyes widened. "Oh." Margaret looked up. "What?" The historian pointed toward several pages. "These aren't public records." Walter stepped closer. "Meaning?" Emma slowly turned another page. "Meaning Henry somehow obtained internal banking information." Silence filled the elevator. Margaret stared at the ledger. If Emma was right, this wasn't merely evidence. It was proof. Real proof. Then they examined the folders. The contents proved even more significant. Internal memos, property appraisals, correspondence between financial institutions. Several documents carried confidential markings. Others contained handwritten notes from Henry. One memo stopped Margaret cold. Strategic foreclosure opportunities. She read the title twice, then a third time. The meaning felt impossible, yet there it was, printed plainly on company letterhead. Walter looked sick. Dear God. Emma remained focused on the document. This isn't negligence. Her voice sounded distant. This is planning. The realization settled heavily over the group. For years, people assumed the farm crisis simply happened. Market conditions, economic pressure, bad luck. Henry's records suggested something else entirely. Then Margaret discovered the final folder. Unlike the others, it contained photographs, dozens of them. Meetings, office buildings, county officials, bank representatives, business executives. Familiar faces appeared repeatedly. Harold Pierce, Victor Grayson's father. Several names from Henry's journals. The same people. The same network, over and over. Then one photograph changed everything. The image showed a private meeting inside what appeared to be a bank conference room. Several men sat around a table reviewing maps. One map was clearly visible. Margaret recognized it instantly. Her county, her community, local farms marked in red ink, properties targeted years before foreclosure ever occurred. Her stomach tightened. Emma stared at the image. "That's it." "What?" Margaret asked. The historian pointed toward the map. "That's the proof." Silence followed. Because she was right. The photograph connected everything. The planning, the targeting, the acquisitions. Suddenly, footsteps echoed somewhere outside the elevator. All three froze. The sound wasn't theirs. Someone else was there. Another footstep followed, then another. Slow, deliberate. Margaret felt her pulse surge immediately. The building became very quiet. Walter moved toward a broken window overlooking the parking area. Then his expression darkened. "We're not alone." Margaret joined him carefully. Outside, two black SUVs had appeared near the entrance road. Men were stepping out. Not farmers, not curious locals. Purposeful men. The kind who arrived knowing exactly where they were going. Emma looked toward the lockbox, then toward the vehicles. "I don't think they're here by accident." No one argued, because for the first time since discovering Henry's hidden archive, someone else had arrived before they could leave. And judging by the timing, whoever was coming through those elevator doors already knew exactly what they were looking for. Margaret didn't speak until the grain elevator had completely disappeared in Walter's rearview mirror. The old pickup truck bounced along a narrow farm road, while golden fields stretched endlessly on either side. Emma sat clutching the backpack filled with Henry's documents, as if someone might snatch it away at any moment. Walter kept glancing into the mirror every few seconds. Nobody liked what had just happened. The men arriving in those black SUVs weren't curious historians. They weren't trespassers looking for scrap metal. They knew exactly where to go. More importantly, they arrived minutes after Margaret found Henry's hidden lockbox. The timing wasn't coincidence anymore. "They knew about the elevator," Emma finally said. Walter nodded. "Looks that way." Margaret stared out the passenger window. "The question is how?" No one answered, because nobody had one. Back at the farmhouse, the atmosphere felt different. The house had become more than a place to live. It had become headquarters, a battlefield disguised as an old family farm. As soon as they arrived, Walter locked every door. Emma carried the documents straight into the hidden basement. Margaret made coffee because it gave her something useful to do while her thoughts settled. 20 minutes later, the three of them sat around Henry's old work table beneath the farmhouse. The hidden archive seemed even more important now. Every shelf represented years of effort. Every folder represented a clue. Henry hadn't spent decades collecting records because he enjoyed paperwork. He had been building a case, piece by piece, year after year. And somehow he knew people would eventually come looking. Emma opened the lockbox contents carefully. The ledger remained impressive. The confidential reports were alarming. But the cassette tapes drew everyone's attention. There were 8 of them, each labeled in Henry's handwriting. Walter disappeared briefly and returned carrying an ancient cassette player covered in dust. Margaret laughed despite everything. You actually still own one? Walter shrugged. Never throw useful things away. The first tape contained nothing extraordinary. A recorded interview with a farmer discussing crop prices. The second focused on local loan disputes. The third featured a conversation with a retired bank employee. Interesting. Useful, but not explosive. Then Emma inserted the fourth tape. Static crackled through the speaker. A few seconds passed. Then voices emerged. Multiple voices. Men speaking in a conference room. Margaret immediately sat forward. The recording quality wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. Someone had secretly recorded a meeting. Papers shuffled. Chairs moved. Coffee cups clinked against a table. Small sounds that somehow made everything feel more real. Then one of the men spoke. The appraisals have already started moving in the right direction. Emma grabbed a notebook immediately. Walter lowered his coffee cup. Margaret stared at the cassette player. The voice sounded confident, comfortable, like a man discussing routine business. Another voice answered, "Good. Once values drop, refinancing becomes impossible." Silence filled the basement except for the tape. Margaret felt a chill run through her. She didn't fully understand banking, but she understood enough. Farmers depended on land values. Loans depended on land values. Lower the value, and suddenly healthy farms could become financial risks. The conversation continued. Numbers, strategies, property maps. Then a name appeared. Harold Pierce. Margaret recognized it immediately from Henry's files. The banker. The man who kept appearing at the center of everything. "Pierce is handling the county approvals," someone said. Another man laughed softly. "He always does." Emma exchanged a look with Margaret. Neither said a word. They didn't need to. Then came another voice, a voice Walter recognized before anyone else. The old farmer slowly sat back in his chair. "That's him." Margaret looked over. "Who?" Walter's expression darkened. "Richard Grayson." The room fell silent. Richard Grayson. Victor Grayson's father, the founder of the company that now owned thousands of acres across the county. Margaret listened carefully. Richard sounded calm, intelligent, professional. The kind of man who could probably convince people he was helping them while taking everything they owned. Then he said something that made Margaret's stomach tighten. "We only need a few foreclosures to begin. The others will panic soon enough." Nobody moved. The tape continued. "Fear spreads faster than paperwork." Laughter followed. Actual laughter. Margaret felt anger rising inside her, not because she was hearing evidence, because she was hearing real people discuss real families like pieces on a game board. Farms weren't numbers. They were homes, generations, lives. Yet nobody in that room seemed concerned. The meeting continued for nearly 30 minutes. Every minute made the situation worse. Land acquisitions had been planned years in advance. Certain farms had been identified as targets. Specific appraisers and bankers were coordinating efforts. None of it sounded accidental. None of it sounded like market forces. It sounded organized, deliberate. When the tape finally ended, nobody spoke for a long time. The silence felt heavy. Walter broke it first. "Henry was right." Margaret nodded slowly. "About all of it." Emma looked down at her notes. "This is stronger than the documents." She wasn't wrong. Papers could be explained away, records could be challenged. But voices were different. Real voices, real conversations, real plans. Then Margaret noticed something unusual. Henry had written additional notes directly on the cassette label, tiny handwriting squeezed into one corner. She picked it up and moved closer to the light. At first, she couldn't make it out. Then the words became clear. Final records stored here. Her pulse quickened immediately. Wait. Emma looked up. Walter leaned forward. Margaret turned the tape so they could see. Beneath the note sat an address. A very specific address. The old First Agricultural Bank building downtown. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The bank had been closed for decades. Most people barely remembered it existed. Yet Henry clearly considered it important. Walter frowned. I haven't thought about that building in 20 years. Emma took the cassette from Margaret and studied the writing. If Henry hid something there, then it mattered, Margaret finished. The realization settled over the room. Another location. Another cache. Another piece of the puzzle. Henry had never trusted one hiding place. He spread evidence across multiple locations, which meant he understood the danger better than anyone realized. Margaret looked around the hidden basement, around the shelves, the journals, the maps, everything her grandfather had spent years protecting. Then she thought about the men arriving at the grain elevator, about Victor Grayson, about the warning note left inside her house. Someone was still trying to bury this story. Someone was still afraid of what Henry Hayes discovered. And tomorrow, if the address on that cassette label was correct, they were going to find out exactly why. Margaret left the farmhouse before sunrise the next morning. She barely touched her coffee. The address written on Henry's cassette tape had occupied her thoughts all night. First Agricultural Bank. The building had been abandoned for nearly 30 years. Yet somehow her grandfather considered it important enough to hide alongside evidence that powerful people were still trying to find. Emma arrived first, carrying a camera and a folder stuffed with notes. Walter followed a few minutes later, looking more tired than usual. The old farmer hadn't slept much either. I still don't like this, he muttered while climbing into the truck. Margaret smiled faintly. You haven't liked any part of this since chapter 1. Walter pointed a finger at her. Exactly. And look how right I've been. Even Emma laughed. The joke eased the tension for a moment. Then they drove into town. The old bank stood near the edge of downtown, separated from newer buildings by an empty parking lot and years of neglect. The structure looked larger than Margaret expected. Red brick, tall windows, faded stone columns. Once, it must have projected trust and stability. Now, broken glass and boarded entrances told a different story. Funny, Emma said quietly. Places that cause the most damage always look respectable. Margaret couldn't disagree. They parked behind the building where overgrown weeds hid an old service entrance. According to Henry's notes, that was where employees once entered. The front doors were chained shut. The rear door hung slightly crooked. Walter examined it briefly. Somebody's been here. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. Recently? The old farmer pointed toward the lock. Fresh scratches marked the metal. Not weeks old. Days. Maybe hours. Emma immediately noticed the same thing. We're not the only people following Henry's clues. Nobody said Victor Grayson's name. Nobody needed to. Inside, the bank smelled of dust and old paper. Sunlight filtered through broken windows, casting strange shadows across the floor. Rows of teller stations stretched along one wall. Offices lined another. Everything felt frozen in time. Margaret imagined customers once standing here discussing mortgages and farm loans. Many of those same people probably lost everything later. The irony wasn't lost on her. They spent the first hour searching. Old filing cabinets, storage rooms, executive offices, most contained nothing useful. Empty shelves, forgotten furniture, water damage, dead ends. Frustration began replacing excitement. Then Walter stopped outside a small office near the back of the building. "Wait." Margaret looked up. "What?" The old farmer pointed toward a wooden bookshelf built into the wall. At first it appeared ordinary. Then Margaret noticed it. The symbol. Henry's symbol. Small, nearly invisible, carved into the side panel. Her pulse immediately quickened. Emma was already moving toward it. No way. The historian ran her fingers across the carving. That's definitely his. Suddenly, everyone felt awake again. Margaret examined the shelf carefully. Several books remained inside. Agricultural reports, financial journals, banking manuals, all decades old. One book sat slightly farther back than the others. She pulled it gently. A click echoed inside the wall. Emma's eyes widened. Walter simply sighed. Of course there's a hidden compartment. The bookshelf shifted outward several inches. Behind it sat a narrow steel door. Margaret stared. How many secret rooms did Grandpa build? Walter thought for a moment. Apparently not enough. The lock on the steel door was old but intact. Margaret reached into her pocket. By now, finding keys among Henry's belongings had become almost routine. The third brass key fit perfectly. The door opened. Behind it sat a compact records room, protected from water and weather. Metal shelves lined every wall. Boxes, folders, ledgers. More documents than any reasonable person should have hidden inside a bank wall. Emma whispered a single word. Wow. Margaret stepped forward slowly. The room felt untouched, preserved, like Henry expected someone to return eventually. On the nearest shelf sat a cardboard box labeled Witness Statements. Her heartbeat accelerated immediately. She opened it. Inside were transcripts, dozens of them. Farmers, bank employees, county workers, appraisers, people who had seen pieces of the scheme unfold. People Henry had interviewed personally. Some statements stretched 20 pages, others only 2. Yet together they formed a devastating picture. Families pressured into impossible loans. Land values manipulated. Foreclosures accelerated. Public officials looking the other way. Margaret picked up one statement from a former loan officer. Halfway through reading, she stopped breathing. The witness described meetings where specific farms were discussed months before any financial problems occurred. Targeted farms, planned acquisitions. The language sounded terrifyingly familiar. They chose the victims first, she whispered. Emma looked over. What? Margaret handed her the pages. The historian read silently. Then her expression hardened. This is it. Walter joined them. Within minutes, all three understood the significance. Henry hadn't merely proven corruption. He had proven intent. The difference was enormous. Then Emma discovered another box. This one carried a different label. Internal correspondence. The folder inside contained letters exchanged between bank executives, county officials, and Grayson Agricultural Holdings. Margaret opened the first letter and immediately recognized Richard Grayson's signature. The second contained Harold Pierce's name. The third connected both men directly. Her pulse raced. Every document tightened the web. Every page removed another excuse. Then they found the final folder. Thick, heavy, sealed inside a waterproof envelope. Henry had written one sentence across the front: "Open only if necessary." Margaret carefully broke the seal. Inside sat a single document, just one, yet it changed everything. The paper was a formal agreement signed decades earlier. Multiple signatures covered the final page. Richard Grayson, Harold Pierce, several banking officials, 2 county commissioners. Margaret stared at the contents. The agreement outlined acquisition targets, financing strategies, and coordinated valuation adjustments. It wasn't evidence of misconduct. It was a blueprint, a written plan, signed, dated, real. The room became completely silent. Even Emma seemed unable to speak. Walter slowly lowered himself onto a chair. Dear God, Margaret understood. For months, Henry had been collecting pieces. Here was the completed picture. Not suspicion, not theory. Proof. Absolute proof. Then Emma noticed something attached to the final page. A handwritten note in Henry's familiar handwriting. Margaret leaned closer. The message contained only one sentence. If you're reading this, the truth is finally safe. Margaret stared at the words. Emotion tightened her throat unexpectedly. For the first time, she understood exactly what her grandfather had been doing. He wasn't trying to win. He wasn't trying to expose anyone immediately. He was preserving the truth long enough for someone else to finish the job. Then a sound echoed from somewhere inside the bank. A door slammed. All 3 froze. Another sound followed. Footsteps, multiple footsteps, moving through the building toward them. Margaret slowly looked toward the hidden room entrance. Emma did the same. Walter stood. Nobody spoke, because they all understood the same thing at exactly the same moment. Someone else had found the bank. The footsteps stopped just outside the hidden records room. Margaret could hear muffled voices somewhere beyond the bookshelf. Her fingers tightened around the folder containing Henry's final evidence. Emma stood frozen beside the shelves. Walter quietly moved toward the hidden door and listened. Nobody breathed for several seconds. Then a voice echoed from the office outside. Search everything. Margaret immediately recognized it. Victor Grayson. Not from personal experience, from countless recordings, photographs, and stories. Yet somehow hearing his voice in person felt different, more real, more dangerous. Walter slowly shook his head. He's here himself. Emma looked stunned. Why would he come personally? Margaret glanced down at the signed agreement in her hands. Because he knows what's in here. The answer seemed obvious now. For weeks, Victor had acted calm, patient, reasonable. Yet every move pointed toward one truth. He was afraid. Not of rumors, not of accusations. Of evidence. Real evidence. The kind Henry Hayes spent 40 years protecting. Outside, drawers opened. Filing cabinets slammed shut. Someone was tearing through the abandoned bank. Victor's people were searching room by room, getting closer. Margaret looked around. The hidden records room suddenly felt very small. Then Walter noticed something. A narrow service corridor at the rear of the room, nearly invisible behind a row of shelves. Henry planned for this. Margaret smiled despite the tension. Of course he did. Her grandfather seemed to have planned for everything. Minutes later, the 3 of them slipped through the corridor carrying the most important documents. The passage led to an old maintenance exit opening into an alley behind the bank. By the time Victor's team discovered the hidden records room, Margaret and the others were already gone. The drive back to the farm felt strangely quiet. Nobody celebrated. Not yet. The evidence was safe, but the fight wasn't over. That changed 3 days later. Emma contacted a state investigative journalist she trusted, then another. Copies of the documents went to attorneys, historians, state regulators. Every piece of evidence Henry preserved was duplicated and distributed. No single person controlled the truth anymore. That was exactly what Henry would have wanted. The story exploded faster than anyone expected. Local newspapers picked it up first, then regional outlets, then state media. The recordings, the witness statements, the signed agreements, the secret planning meetings. Everything surfaced. People who had spent decades believing their families simply failed suddenly discovered a different story. Former farmers began calling. Children and grandchildren of displaced families came forward. Some still carried old photographs of farms that no longer existed. Others brought letters, journals, and records of their own. Every day revealed something new. Every day confirmed Henry had been right. Margaret spent long evenings sitting at the kitchen table answering phone calls. One afternoon, an elderly woman drove 3 hours just to thank her. Her father had lost his farm during the crisis. For 40 years, he blamed himself. "He died believing he failed us," the woman said quietly. Tears filled her eyes. "Now I know what really happened." Margaret thought about that conversation for a long time afterward, because the story was never really about documents. It was about people. It always had been. Several months later, state investigators officially confirmed what Henry's records had suggested all along. Fraud, manipulated valuations, coordinated foreclosures, corrupt land acquisitions. The evidence proved impossible to dismiss. Victor Grayson resigned from his company shortly afterward. Several investigations followed. Lawsuits appeared. Settlements began. The details filled newspapers for months. Margaret barely followed most of it. By then, she cared about something else. The families, the history, the truth. Autumn arrived. The fields surrounding the Hayes farm turned gold beneath the afternoon sun. Harvest season returned just as it had every year for generations. Yet the farm felt different now. Alive. People visited constantly. Historians helped catalog Henry's archive. Students volunteered to digitize records. Former farm families attended community gatherings. The old farmhouse no longer felt isolated. It had become a place people returned to. One evening, Margaret stood inside the hidden basement looking at the shelves her grandfather had built. Everything was organized now, preserved properly. The secret room no longer needed to remain secret. Footsteps sounded behind her. Walter, of course. The old farmer carried 2 cups of coffee. Some habits had become traditions. "Thought you might be down here." Margaret accepted the cup. "I usually am." Walter looked around the archive. His eyes lingered on the maps covering one wall. Henry would have liked this. Margaret smiled softly. "You think so?" Walter laughed. He'd complain about something first. She laughed with him. That sounded exactly right. The old farmer grew quiet for a moment. But he'd be proud. The words landed harder than she expected, because deep down, part of her had been doing all of this for Henry. The grandfather who taught her to drive a tractor, the man who spent decades protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, the man who believed the truth mattered even when nobody wanted to hear it. Several weeks later, the county hosted a public event on the Hayes farm. Hundreds of people attended. Former farm families, journalists, historians, neighbors, Children ran through fields where previous generations once worked. Old photographs lined display boards. Stories were shared. Names were remembered. For the first time in decades, the missing farms were part of local history again. As sunset approached, Margaret stood near the edge of the property watching people gather beneath strings of lights stretched between barns. Laughter drifted across the fields. Music played somewhere in the distance. The farm no longer looked abandoned. It looked alive. Emma joined her carrying 2 paper cups of cider. "Quite a turnout." Margaret nodded. "Yeah." For a moment, neither woman spoke. They simply watched families reconnect with pieces of their history. Finally, Emma smiled. "Funny thing." Margaret glanced over. "What?" The historian pointed toward the farmhouse. "You came here because your life fell apart." Margaret laughed softly. "That's true. Turns out your grandfather left you a future." The statement lingered long after Emma walked away, because it was true. 1 year earlier, Margaret Hayes had arrived at the farm, believing she was starting over after losing everything: the divorce, the house, the life she thought she understood. She came home because she had nowhere else to go. Instead, she found a hidden basement, a forgotten legacy, and a purpose she never expected. As darkness settled across the fields, Margaret looked toward the farmhouse porch where Henry used to sit every evening. For a brief moment, she could almost imagine him there, watching, smiling quietly to himself. The truth had survived. The families had been remembered. And the farm he fought so hard to protect was finally full of life again. At 60 years old, Margaret Hayes returned to her family farm because she thought it was the last chapter of her story. She never imagined it was actually the beginning.